She said it at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, standing in the doorway of the home I had shared with her son for 9 years. I know the exact time because my phone was in my hand when she said it. I had just finished photographing the last of the documents from Marcus's desk, and the timestamp is right there in the metadata. 11:47 and 3 seconds a.m. She didn't know about the documents. She didn't know about a lot of things. Leaving you, she said, was the best decision my son ever made. She had rehearsed it. I could tell by the way she lifted her chin on the word best. Like she'd been saving it. I closed the desk drawer. I looked at her. I said, "Thank you for stopping by, Patricia." She left 5 minutes later. And what happened in the months that followed was not something I planned out of spite. It was something I uncovered because I count things for a living. And when I count, I don't stop until the number is right. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories New, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts, and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe. This one took me almost 2 years to tell. I think you'll understand why. My name is irrelevant. What matters is what I do. I am a forensic accountant. Have been for 14 years. I trace money the way other people trace family trees, back through every branch, every joint, every hidden root, until I find where it started and where it actually went. I've worked fraud cases, divorce proceedings, estate disputes, corporate audits. What I've learned doing that work is that numbers don't lie. People do. But their numbers always tell on them eventually. I met Marcus Devlin when I was 31. He was 34. He was an architect, the kind who builds things slowly and right. He had his mother's eyes and his late father's patience. And he laughed in a way that was so quiet you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. I paid attention. I always paid attention. We married in September. 43 people. His mother gave a toast about how she hoped I could make him happy the way his father had made her happy. I have the video. I have watched it since, looking for what I missed. I don't think I missed anything. I think she meant it then. The Devlin family ran on a particular kind of arithmetic. Marcus had a younger sister, Tara, who was beautiful in the way of people who expect to be looked at. Always poised, always slightly aggrieved, always half a step behind whatever she was supposed to be doing. She had Patricia's attention the way a favorite bookmark holds a favorite page. Constantly returned to, never moved. And Marcus had Patricia's love. But love in their household was not the same as priority. Priority was different. Priority had a bank account. I didn't see the accounting behind that for years. What I saw was a family who called constantly, visited often, borrowed casually, and thanked rarely. What I absorbed slowly, the way you absorb something you've normalized, was that Marcus and I were the ones who drove to them. We were the ones who covered the shortfall when Tara's business venture fell apart in 2017. We were the ones who spent 4 weekends helping Patricia move into her new house after the old one sold. Even though Marcus had 3 deadlines that month and I was in the middle of a federal audit. We showed up. It's what we did. It's what Marcus did. He was, at his core, someone who could not leave a thing undone. I loved that about him. Later, I would understand it differently. The marriage didn't end dramatically. That's the part that still surprises me when I say it out loud. There was no affair discovered. No screaming fight that broke something that couldn't be fixed. What happened was quieter and, in some ways, worse. Marcus changed. Or maybe he'd always been this way and I'd been so busy counting other people's numbers that I'd missed the changes in ours. He became distant in the way of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to say it. He stopped asking about my cases. He stopped telling me about his. We had dinner together with the specific formality of 2 people who had agreed without agreeing that they were not going to fight tonight. In March of last year, he sat down across from me at the kitchen table and told me he thought we should separate. I said, "Okay." He looked startled. He'd expected more. I didn't have more. "I care about you," he said. "I just think." Marcus. I folded my hands on the table. We can talk about this properly, or we can talk about it with attorneys. Either way is fine with me. Which would you prefer? He chose attorneys. It was, I think, the most honest thing he'd said to me in 6 months. I will not tell you that I was fine. I will tell you that I reorganized the filing cabinet that night. I sorted every joint document by category: taxes, property, insurance, financial disclosures, and I cross-referenced each one with our shared records. I don't know how long I was at it. When I looked up, it was 3 a.m. and my coffee was cold, and I had built a spreadsheet with 11 tabs. This is what I do when I am not fine. There was a folder in Marcus's section of the cabinet I had never opened. We were not the kind of couple who kept secrets, or so I believed, which is perhaps a sentence that should serve as its own warning. The folder was labeled in Marcus's handwriting, Dad/Estate/Final. His father had died 4 years before I met Marcus. I had understood the estate to be long settled. I had understood there to be very little left of it. I put the folder on my desk and I photographed each page. Every single one. 11 pages. And I went to bed and I did not look at them again for 2 weeks, because something in me knew that once I looked properly, the number was going to be wrong. I was right. The attorneys connected Marcus and me to a mediation process, and in that process standard financial disclosures were required. Marcus's were incomplete. Not fraudulently so, just incomplete in the way of someone who had inherited something he'd half forgotten about and never thought to mention during 9 years of marriage, because it had never been active. It wasn't active yet. My attorney noticed it. She flagged a reference in Marcus's disclosures to something called the Devlin Family Revocable Trust, established by his late father, Richard Devlin, in 2008. It appeared as an asset of unclear value. Marcus's disclosure listed it as minimal. Under administration. I am a forensic accountant. Under administration is not a value. Minimal is not a number. I asked my attorney to request the full trust documents. We received them on a Thursday afternoon. She called me at 4:15 p.m. and said, "I think you need to come in." I drove to her office. I sat across from her desk. She slid the documents toward me and said, "Take your time." I read them 3 times. The first time for understanding. The second time for confirmation. The third time to make sure I hadn't invented what I was seeing. I had not invented it. Richard Devlin had established the trust in 2008, yes. It held, at the time of its establishment, a commercial property in the city's warehouse district, a building Richard had bought in 1991 and spent 20 years maintaining. The trust had appreciated. The commercial property alone was currently assessed at $1.4 million. There were also 2 smaller investment accounts inside the trust, totaling approximately $380,000. The trust had been professionally managed since Richard's death. It had been quietly, steadily growing. Total value, approximately $1.78 million. And here is the part that made me set the document down and press my palms flat on my attorney's conference table. The trust named 2 beneficiaries, Marcus as primary, and his spouse as co-beneficiary. The clause was specific. It was dated, signed, and witnessed. Richard Devlin, who I had never met, who had died before I entered his son's life, had updated the trust 2 years after Marcus and I married. He had amended the document to include Marcus's spouse, whoever that was, whoever Marcus chose, as a co-beneficiary with equal rights to any distribution during the marriage. There was a handwritten note clipped to the amendment. My attorney read one line of it aloud to me, very quietly. "I didn't have a daughter. I'd like Marcus's wife to know she has a father in this." I looked at the note. I looked at the trust. I looked at the window. Then I asked my attorney if I could have a few minutes alone, and she stepped out, and I sat very still in that conference room for approximately 7 minutes, and I thought about a man I had never met who had written that sentence about me, without knowing my name, without knowing anything except that his son had chosen me, and that was enough for him. Then I picked up my pen and I started making notes. The secondary revelation came 3 days later, in the form of a letter from the trust's administrator. Tucked inside the trust documents was a contingent clause I had almost missed on my first 2 readings. The property, in the event of dissolution of Marcus's marriage, would revert to a single beneficiary structure, Marcus only, unless the spouse had been a named party for 5 or more years at the time of dissolution. Marcus and I had been married for 9 years. The amendment naming me as co-beneficiary had been executed 7 years ago. I had been a named party for 7 years. I called my attorney and I said, "What does this mean for the dissolution proceedings?" She said, "It means you have standing. You have legal documented standing as a co-beneficiary of a trust worth approximately $1.7 million. Marcus's disclosure of this as minimal was a problem." "Yes," I said. "It was." I went home. I made tea. I read both documents a 4th time, and then I opened my laptop and I built a new spreadsheet. 12 tabs this time. If you've ever watched people who spent 9 years treating someone like overhead suddenly discover that person had a balance sheet they never bothered to read, you already know where this is going. Stay with me. The folder hasn't been opened yet. Not in front of anyone who matters. Started with Tara. She called me the week after the mediation session, which was interesting because Tara had not called me in approximately 14 months before that. The call lasted 6 minutes. She talked mostly about how hard this must be, about how she knew Marcus hadn't meant any harm, about how the family, she used that word 3 times, just wanted everyone to land on their feet. I let her talk. At the end she said, very carefully, "And obviously Marcus's father's estate is going to be handled inside the family." I said, "Obviously." She exhaled. "I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page." I said, "I'll think about everything and be in touch." Patricia came next. She showed up at the house, the house that was still technically in my name, on a Tuesday morning. I opened the door and she stood there in a blue coat I had given her for Christmas 3 years ago. And she said, "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made." She had more to say after that. About how I'd always been cold, how I'd never really been part of the family, how Marcus had told her I was difficult, how the money, and there it was, she said the money just like that belonged to the Devlins. I let her finish. My phone was in my hand. The timestamp said 11:47 a.m. When she was done I said, "Thank you for stopping by, Patricia." She waited, maybe expecting more. I didn't give her more. She left. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway. I looked at the photograph on the entry table, Marcus and me, taken on our 4th anniversary, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said. I looked at that photograph for about 30 seconds. Then I picked up my phone and called my attorney. I said, "Send the letters." The gathering was Patricia's idea. She called it a family meeting, which was a term I found interesting since I was no longer family, or so I'd been told. She asked me to come. I understood what the meeting was. It was an attempt to resolve the trust issue without involving the courts, which meant it was an attempt to resolve the trust issue in the Devlins' favor before I could finish filing. I accepted. I spent the night before preparing a folder, a blue one because I find the color calming. Inside, the trust documents, the amendment with Richard's note, my attorney's written analysis of my co-beneficiary standing, the timeline of Marcus's financial disclosures alongside the actual trust valuations, and 3 screenshots. The screenshots were from a group text chain I had been accidentally included in, a chain between Patricia, Tara, and Marcus's cousin Brian, in which they discussed in very specific terms how to present the trust dissolution to me as a fait accompli. The first message was from Patricia. It said, "She won't fight it. She never fights anything." The timestamp on that message was 9:23 p.m., 2 days after I had said, "Send the letters." I printed all 3 screenshots on plain paper. I placed them at the back of the folder behind the legal documents. Last things last. I arrived 8 minutes early. Patricia's house. The same one Marcus and I had spent 4 weekends moving her into. I had picked the paint color in the living room. She'd asked me to. I had chosen a blue-gray that she said she loved. She hadn't changed it. There were 6 people at the table. Patricia, Tara, Marcus, Marcus's cousin Brian, who was apparently functioning as some kind of informal counsel, Brian's wife Sandra, who I think was there to provide emotional ballast, and an older woman I didn't recognize who was introduced to me as Patricia's sister Ruth. Ruth, I would later learn, was the one person in that room who had read the trust documents herself. Patricia opened. She talked about Richard's wishes, about family unity, about how complicated estate law could be, and how much easier it would be to handle this quietly, between people who loved each other. She talked for approximately 4 minutes. She was composed and generous and completely full of numbers she had invented herself. Then Tara said, "We all just want what Dad would have wanted." Marcus looked at the table. Brian said that he'd spoken to someone in the legal field. He did not name this person, who had indicated that co-beneficiary clauses in family trusts were often ceremonial and not always enforceable. I waited until he was finished. Then I said, "May I?" Patricia smiled. The smile of someone who thinks they've already won. "Of course, sweetheart." I opened the blue folder. I said, "I want to start with the trust amendment. Page 4. Richard Devlin executed this in 2016, 2 years after Marcus and I were married. It was witnessed by 2 parties and notarized. Under this amendment, I am named as co-beneficiary with equal distribution rights during the marriage." I turned the page to face the center of the table. The marriage has not yet been legally dissolved. As of today, I retain full co-beneficiary standing. Silence. I continued. The trust's contingency clause on page 9 requires 5 years of named co-beneficiary status before dissolution to retain standing. I was named in 2016. The filing was initiated in 2025. That is 9 years. I laid that page beside the first. The math is not close. Tara said, "That's not," and stopped. I said, "The total current valuation of the trust, as assessed by the administrator's most recent report, is $1,780,000. Marcus's mediation disclosure described this as minimal, under administration. I have included the administrator's report and his disclosure side by side on page 7. Brian's wife Sandra reached for her water glass. She did not drink from it. She just held it. "I'm not finished," I said, and my voice was the same tone it had been when I started. Flat. Precise. The tone I use when I'm presenting findings to a federal examiner. Patricia came to my home on Tuesday. She told me that leaving me was the best decision Marcus ever made, and that the money belonged to the Devlins. I looked at Patricia directly. "I'd like you to understand that I recorded that conversation. I've included the transcript on page 11. Patricia's face did something complicated. And finally, I reached to the back of the folder. I placed the 3 screenshots on the table, face up, spread so everyone at the table could read them without picking them up. This is a group message chain from 2 weeks ago. I was accidentally added to it by Brian, who was trying to forward it to his wife and misdirected it to me. I'd like to read one message aloud. This is Patricia's message, sent at 9:23 p.m. on the 14th. I read it without inflection. She won't fight it. She never fights anything. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator in the kitchen. I looked at Marcus. He was still looking at the table. His hands were folded in front of him and he was very still, and in that stillness he looked for just a moment, exactly like his father had looked in the one photograph I had seen of Richard Devlin. Patient and sorry and too late. He said quietly, "I didn't know about the group message." I believed him. That was the thing about Marcus. He wasn't cruel. He was passive, which is not the same thing but which has many of the same outcomes. It was Ruth, Patricia's sister, the one I didn't know, who spoke next. She said, without drama, without apology, "Patricia, you need to call your attorney." Patricia looked at her sister. "Ruth." "Tonight," Ruth said. "Not after dinner. Tonight." That was the extent of Ruth's conscience moment. She didn't apologize to me. She didn't address me at all. But I noted it the way I note all data points. I closed the folder. Picked it up. I stood. I said, "Marcus's father wrote something in the amendment note. One line. I'll leave you with it. I didn't look at the note. I had memorized it. He wrote, I didn't have a daughter. I'd like Marcus's wife to know she has a father in this. I let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then I said, he signed the document. That's the difference between what he did and what you said. I walked to the door. I put on my coat. I drove home. The settlement took 4 months. My attorney and the trust administrator and Marcus's attorney worked through every clause, every valuation, every disclosure discrepancy. The commercial property was appraised at $1.4 million. The investment accounts had grown slightly during proceedings. Final trust valuation, $1.81 million. As co-beneficiary during an intact marriage period, I was entitled to half. Marcus did not contest it. I think by then, he understood that contesting it would mean presenting his disclosure, the one that called $1.81 million minimal, in front of a judge. He was an architect who built things slowly and right. He knew when a structure was unsound. My settlement was $905,000. I kept the house. We had purchased it jointly with equal contributions. It was appraised and bought out cleanly. I made no claim beyond what the numbers supported. I have never made a claim beyond what the numbers support. Tara sent one text message after the settlement closed. It said, I hope you're happy. I read it. I did not respond. I archived it in a folder labeled plainly Tara. Patricia did not contact me. I did not expect her to. Brian issued something that functioned, structurally, as an apology. He called my attorney's office and left a message saying he had not intended the group message to reach me. My attorney relayed this. I said, noted. And that was the end of that. Marcus called me once 3 weeks after the settlement. He said he was sorry. Not for the divorce. He didn't apologize for the divorce. He apologized for the disclosure. He said he hadn't thought of the trust as real money, which was a remarkable thing for an adult to say about $1.81 million, but I understood what he meant. He had inherited the avoidance along with the asset. I said, you should call your father's estate attorney. Have him walk you through the documents. All of them. Your dad was meticulous. There was a pause. He said, yeah, he was. That was our last real conversation. The blue folder lives in my filing cabinet now. 3rd drawer labeled Devlin closed. I don't return to it often. I don't need to. The numbers are settled. The documents are signed. The thing is finished. What I did with part of the settlement is this. I found a scholarship program at the School of Architecture that Marcus's father had attended. Richard Devlin, I learned, had started his career without money and built everything himself. The scholarship supports first-generation students in architecture and design who demonstrate the kind of patient, careful work that doesn't get noticed until it's finished. I made a contribution in Richard Devlin's name. Not in Marcus's. Not in mine. His, because the money was always his, and he had made a decision about where it should go. And I was just the one who read the paperwork carefully enough to carry it out. The note is still in the folder. I photographed it and had the photograph framed very small on my desk at the office. Not for display. Just for reference. The reminder that some people decide who you are before they ever meet you. And they do it with a signature, and that means more than anything said in a doorway. There is a particular kind of debt that isn't written down anywhere. It accrues in Sunday afternoons given in covered shortfalls in paint colors chosen. In weekends spent moving someone's furniture so they can feel settled in a house you helped build. I carried that debt for 9 years. I never sent a bill. What I learned, from the documents, from the amendment, from a man I never met who loved his son enough to also love whoever his son chose, is that the opposite of being taken for granted is not being thanked. It is simply being seen. I was seen. In ink. On a notarized document. Dated and witnessed. That's the receipt. That's the whole receipt. If this story reminded you that the quietest people in the room are often the ones who have already read everything, and that being calm is not the same as being finished, take that as your sign. Update whatever needs updating. Put your name on what belongs to you. And if someone has ever stood in your doorway and told you your absence was someone else's best decision, remember, they hadn't read the documents yet. Drop a comment. Hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.